wind howled against the station walls, a constant, mind-numbing force that rattled the metal shutters and seeped through the cracks. Inside, I adjusted my headset and leaned closer to the radio, straining to hear anything beyond the static. It had been a quiet night until a faint signal crackled through, broken, distorted, but unmistakably human. "This is emergency. Anyone. Outpost. Help, please." I straightened in my chair. The call had come from Outpost Theta, a facility decommissioned nearly a decade ago. No one was supposed to be out there. "Outpost Theta, this is Palmer Station." "Repeat your transmission," I said, turning dials to clear the frequency. Only static replied. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling slowly. It had to be interference, old equipment picking up ghost signals from years past. It happened sometimes, radio waves bouncing through the atmosphere in strange ways. But something about the voice unsettled me. There had been desperation in it, a ragged edge that didn't sound like a trick of the air. I logged the incident, marking the exact time and frequency, and was about to switch off for the night when the radio crackled again. "Palmer, we need coming." Then silence. I stared at the speaker, waiting, hoping for more. Coming? Who was coming? I pushed back from the desk and glanced toward the common area. It was late, but someone needed to hear this. "Doctor." Hensley frowned as I replayed the transmission. He was the station's lead scientist, a methodical man who didn't believe in mysteries. "Outpost Theta's been abandoned for years," he said, rubbing his jaw. "Nothing but rusted metal and ice out there. If someone's broadcasting from that location, they shouldn't be." "You think it's a distress call?" I asked. He shook his head. "Could be old equipment malfunctioning, but let's check with McMurdo." McMurdo was the largest station in Antarctica, the closest thing we had to a regional command center. Hensley radioed them, explaining what I'd picked up. Their response came back a minute later. "No scheduled personnel at Theta. Last check-in confirmed all structures non-operational. No flights or expeditions near that area." I exchanged a look with Hensley. If no one was there, then who had sent the transmission? "Only way to be sure is to check it out," Hensley said. We set out at dawn, 3 of us packed into a snowcat, Hensley, myself, and Patel, one of our field researchers. The storm had died down, but the temperature remained brutal, well below freezing. As we rumbled across the ice, Outpost Theta came into view, a cluster of buildings half buried in drifts. The structures were in worse shape than I expected. Rust streaked the metal walls, and sections of roofing had caved in. The place had been swallowed by the cold, forgotten. Patel and I stepped out first, our boots crunching against the frozen ground. Hensley followed, radio in hand. "Whoever sent that transmission might be inside," he said. "Let's start with the comms room." The door to the main building groaned as we forced it open. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and old insulation. Frost coated the walls. We moved cautiously, our flashlights sweeping through the darkness. Equipment lay scattered across the floor, desks overturned. Something had disturbed this place. Patel found the radio room first. "Over here." The equipment was ancient, dials rusted, wires frayed. But one thing stood out. A single transmitter had been powered on. Hensley frowned. "That's impossible. The generators here haven't worked in years." I reached for the dial, but before I could touch it, the radio crackled to life on its own. A voice, garbled, fragmented, spilled through the speaker. "Palmer Station, you should not." A loud thunk sounded from somewhere in the building. We turned as one, flashlights darting across the hall. "That came from the storage area," Patel whispered. My breath came in short bursts as we stepped forward, boots heavy against the frozen floor. The storage room door hung slightly open, swinging on rusted hinges. I reached for it and pushed it wide. Inside, something moved. A shape, hunched, wrapped in tattered clothing, curled against the far wall. At first, I thought it was a pile of debris, but then it shifted, lifting its head, eyes, sunken and hollow, locked onto mine. Patel gasped. "Jesus, he's still alive." The man was emaciated, his skin stretched tight over sharp bones. He shuddered violently, lips cracked, hands curled against his chest. His beard was thick with frost, his suit ragged. Hensley crouched beside him. "Can you hear me?" The man's lips moved, but no sound came. His eyes darted to the door, wide with something that looked like fear. I followed his gaze. The hallway behind us was empty. But the way he was looking, like something should have been there, sent a deep unease through me. Hensley unhooked his radio. "We need an evac team, now." Patel reached for his canteen, offering water, but the man barely reacted. His breathing was slow, his limbs stiff. How long had he been here? And how had he survived? As we carried him out to the snowcat, he muttered something under his breath. "Not alone." We didn't stop to check the station again. We climbed into the snowcat, and Hensley pushed the throttle hard, the vehicle lurching forward. The man didn't speak again. By the time we reached Palmer Station, he was dead. His body was examined, and the findings made no sense. He had severe frostbite, dehydration, and signs of prolonged malnutrition. But here's the thing. He wasn't some old researcher from a forgotten expedition. His suit was military issue, dated only a few years ago. There were no official records of a team being sent to Theta in that time. No reports of missing personnel. No explanations. We checked the logs, searching for any connection. Eventually, Patel found something buried in old files. 8 years ago, a classified operation had taken place at Outpost Theta, supposedly to recover lost research. No names were listed, no details given. Had this man been part of that mission? If so, how had he survived out there, alone, for so long? And most unsettling of all, if he'd really been alone, then who had sent the transmission? There were no further signals after that night. No movement detected when a second team returned to Outpost Theta weeks later. They found the transmitter, but no footprints, no evidence of anyone else ever being there. Just the empty station, wind howling through its broken walls. A few years ago, during one of the worst blizzards I've ever driven through, I found something I still can't explain. It was me, my girlfriend Lisa, and our friend Dan, heading up to a cabin in the mountains for the weekend. The storm hit hard while we were still an hour away. The snow was relentless, slamming against the windshield, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The wipers barely made a difference. The road signs had vanished under thick layers of white, and the GPS was practically useless. Lisa checked her phone. "Still no signal," she muttered. "We should turn back," she said after a while, her voice tight. "We don't even know if we're still on the right road." I gripped the wheel, eyes darting between the swirling snow and the faint glow of the high beams. "We're closer to the cabin than the town. If we turn around, we might get stranded in the middle of nowhere." Dan, leaning forward from the back seat, muttered, "Feels like we already are." Then, through the storm, something appeared. I hit the brakes hard. A snowcat. It was sitting dead in the middle of the road, half buried in fresh snow. A massive machine, the kind road crews use to clear heavy snowfall, but this one wasn't moving. No flashing lights, no rumbling engine, and the driver's door was wide open. Lisa gripped my arm. "Where's the driver?" I pulled up alongside it, rolling down the window. Freezing air rushed in, biting at my skin. I hesitated before calling out. "Hello?" Nothing. Dan exhaled sharply. "We should check it out. Someone could be stuck out here." I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but Dan was already pulling on his coat. I killed the engine, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out into the storm. Lisa reluctantly followed. The wind was deafening, tearing through the trees, sending blasts of ice and snow across my face. I kept my head down and trudged forward, boots crunching into the deep snow. Up close, the snowcat looked abandoned. The engine was off, but the door left open made me uneasy. Dan climbed up onto the step and peered inside. Keys are still in the ignition. I shined my flashlight inside. The cab was empty, but something wasn't right. The seat was still warm. Whoever had been driving hadn't been gone long. Lisa hugged herself. Where would they go in this? I swept my light around the snow, expecting to see footprints leading away. There were none. Dan frowned. Maybe they went into the woods? But there aren't any tracks, Lisa shot back. I turned my flashlight toward the tree line. The forest loomed in complete darkness, the storm swallowing everything beyond the first few rows of trees. Then I heard it, a crunch. Lisa grabbed my arm. Did you hear that? Dan turned his head, eyes wide. Yeah. The sound hadn't come from the road. It had come from the forest. I swept my flashlight back and forth, but the beam barely cut through the thick snowfall. Then, another crunch. Closer this time. We need to get back in the car, Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dan hesitated for a second longer, but then he saw my face. We backed away from the snowcat, moving quickly toward our car. I climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors as Lisa and Dan scrambled inside. I turned the key. The engine struggled against the cold before roaring to life. As I shifted into drive, Lisa let out a sharp gasp. Someone's standing back there. I shot a look in the rearview mirror, but I couldn't see anything through the snow. Where? By the trees, she whispered. I swear I saw someone. Dan twisted around, staring out the back window. I don't see anything. Lisa was shaking her head. They were just... A shotgun blast rang out from the forest. The sharp explosion of sound tore through the storm, echoing off the trees. I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires skidded for a second before catching, and we shot forward, swerving around the abandoned snowcat. Lisa had her hands over her mouth, eyes locked on the side window, as if expecting to see someone step out of the woods. Dan kept glancing over his shoulder. Drive, man. Just drive. I didn't need to be told twice. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, my focus locked on the winding road ahead. We didn't stop until we reached the cabin. Inside, with the doors locked and the fire crackling weakly in the fireplace, none of us said much. What was the snowcat doing there? Why was it abandoned? The whole situation still unsettles me, especially knowing someone was out there in the woods. And whoever they weren't just standing around. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. The winter of 2016 was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. Just me, Will, and Sarah, nestled in a remote cabin deep in the mountains. The kind of place where the air is so crisp it feels like it's cleaning your lungs with every breath, and the snow blankets everything in a silence so profound it's almost sacred. We had planned for days of skiing, nights by the fire, and the kind of conversations that only happen when the world feels far away. But the blizzard changed everything. It came on the second night, a furious, howling thing that seemed to rise out of nowhere. The power went out almost immediately, plunging us into a darkness that felt heavier than usual. We weren't worried, though. The cabin was sturdy, the firewood plentiful, and the pantry stocked. We huddled around the wood stove, passing a bottle of whiskey and playing cards by the flickering light of a few candles. The wind outside sounded like a living thing, clawing at the windows and rattling the door in its frame. But inside, we were warm, safe, and together. At some point, I drifted off to sleep on the couch, lulled by the crackling fire and the whiskey's warmth. When I woke, it was past 3 a.m. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was freezing. My breath hung in the air like a ghostly cloud. That's when I saw it, the front door. It was open, just a few inches, but enough to let in a thin drift of snow that glittered in the faint light from the hearth. I sat up, my heart pounding. Will and Sarah were still asleep, curled up in their sleeping bags near the fire. No one had left the cabin. I got up, my feet numb against the cold floor, and shut the door, making sure the latch caught. I stood there for a moment, listening. The wind had died down, and the forest outside was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I told myself it was nothing, just the storm playing tricks on me, and went back to sleep. The next morning, I didn't mention it. Will checked his phone. Still no service, he muttered. None of us had a signal, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. We spent the day inside, melting snow for water, playing cards, and trying to ignore the unease that had settled over us. But the image of that open door kept creeping into my thoughts. Had I forgotten to lock it? Had the wind blown it open? Or had something or someone opened it from the outside? That night, we turned in early, exhausted from the tension and the monotony of being trapped indoors. I fell into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by a sound that froze my blood. A scream. It was distant, muffled by the wind and the trees, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, raw and panicked, cutting through the silence like a knife. I sat up, my heart racing. Across the room, Sarah stirred, her eyes wide with fear. "You heard that, right?" she whispered. The scream came again, closer this time. It wasn't a word, just a sound of pure terror. Will sat up, rubbing his face. "What the hell?" I crossed to the window, my breath fogging the glass. The snow had stopped, but a thick fog had rolled in, swallowing the forest in a dense, impenetrable gray. The trees were barely visible, their shapes distorted and ghostly. "We have to check," Will said, already pulling on his boots. Sarah grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? We don't know what's out there." "She could be lost," he argued. "It's freezing. We can't just ignore it." I didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to lock the door and pretend we hadn't heard anything. But Will was already unbolting the door, and I couldn't let him go alone. The cold hit us like a wall as we stepped onto the porch. The fog was so thick it felt like we were walking into a void. Our flashlights barely pierced the gloom, the beams scattering uselessly in the mist. Snow crunched beneath our boots as we moved toward the tree line, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "Hello?" Will called out. His voice was swallowed by the fog, leaving no echo. "Is someone there?" There was no answer. Just the oppressive silence and the faint creak of trees swaying in the wind. We pushed forward a few more steps, but the fog was too dense. The trees disappeared into a wall of gray, and the ground beneath us felt uneven, treacherous. "We can't keep going," I said, my voice trembling. "If we get lost out here." Will hesitated, then nodded. We turned back, the fog closing in behind us like a curtain. As we reached the cabin, I glanced over my shoulder. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow moving in the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. We locked the door behind us and sat in silence, the weight of what we'd heard and what we hadn't seen, hanging heavy in the air. None of us slept that night. The scream didn't come again, but the silence was almost worse, filled with the unspoken fear that something was out there, waiting. By morning, the storm had passed and the fog had lifted. The forest was eerily calm, the snow pristine and untouched. We dug out the car and left without discussing what had happened. It wasn't until we had cell service again that Will called the local ranger station. They searched the area but found nothing. No missing hikers, no abandoned campsites, no signs of anyone being out there. The ranger assured us it was probably just the wind playing tricks on us, but I didn't believe it. Neither did Will or Sarah. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. The scream, the fog, the open door, and the feeling that something or someone had been watching us from the shadows just beyond the trees.